There are talents that bloom in darkness, gifts that flourish despite chains, and minds that map entire worlds while confined to a single room. This is the story of one such mind, a story whispered in the corridors of military academies, debated by historians, and carefully erased from official records. What you're about to hear sounds impossible, yet every detail that follows has been meticulously reconstructed from letters, journals, and testimonies that survived fires, wars, and deliberate destruction. The question you'll ask yourself by the end is not whether this happened, but why no one wants you to know it did. The plantation ledgers of Hacienda San Rafael in colonial Peru listed him simply as Mateo, field hand, age uncertain, property acquired 1781. No surname, no birthplace, no past worth recording. He was approximately 9 years old when Don Hernan Villagran, a minor landowner with major debts, purchased him at a Lima auction house alongside 3 mules and a shipment of iron tools. Mateo was small for his age, with hands already calloused from work. No child should know. His eyes, however, held something the auctioneer hadn't advertised, an unsettling intensity, as if he were constantly calculating distances no one else could see. The hacienda sat in a valley where 3 rivers converged, creating a natural maze of waterways that shifted with every rainy season. Cargo frequently went missing, messengers got lost. Even experienced muleteers sometimes took 3 days to complete routes that should have taken 1. Don Hernan's neighbors joked that the valley itself was cursed with confusion. Mateo worked in silence those first months. He hauled water, tended animals, slept in the quarters with 24 other slaves. But the overseers noticed something peculiar. Whenever sent on an errand, even to places he'd never been, Mateo never got lost. Not once. At first, they attributed it to luck, then a test. One morning, the head overseer, a Portuguese man named Tiago, deliberately gave Mateo contradictory directions to a storage shed on the property's eastern boundary. He told the boy to go north past the crooked pine, then east at the stone wall, then south along the creek, a route that would lead him in circles. Mateo listened carefully, nodded, and walked away. He returned in half the expected time, having gone directly to the shed by a path Tiago didn't even realize existed. When questioned, the boy said simply, "The sun was there," pointing, so east had to be there. The shed was east. I went east. Tiago laughed it off, but he mentioned it to Don Hernan during their weekly accounting. Don Hernan was drowning in debt. His coffee crops had failed 2 seasons running. His silver mining venture had collapsed when the tunnel flooded. Creditors circled like vultures. He needed a miracle, or at minimum, a profitable distraction. That distraction arrived in the form of General Don Sebastián Alvarez, a Spanish military officer stationed in Lima who'd heard rumors of excellent hunting in the San Rafael Valley. The general came with an entourage, 3 junior officers, a mapmaker named Felipe, servants, guards, and enough baggage to supply a small expedition. Don Hernan saw opportunity. He opened his home, served his finest wine, organized hunts he could barely afford. If he could curry favor with the general, perhaps doors in Lima would open. Perhaps loans would materialize. On the 3rd day of the visit, the hunting party got catastrophically lost. They'd ventured into the hill country east of the hacienda, tracking deer. Felipe, the military mapmaker, had charted their route carefully on parchment, marking landmarks and compass bearings. But the valleys all looked identical. Same vegetation, same rock formations, same winding creeks. By late afternoon, Felipe's map had led them in a complete circle back to their starting point. The general's mood darkened. The junior officers exchanged nervous glances. Don Hernan felt his opportunity slipping away with every wrong turn. Then someone remembered. The landowner has a slave boy who never gets lost. They sent for Mateo. The boy arrived, barefoot and silent, before a group of mounted officers in polished boots and military brass. The general barely glanced at him. "They say you know these hills," the general said, not as a question. Mateo nodded. "Can you lead us back to the hacienda?" The boy looked at the sky, at the shadows on the ground, at the angle of light filtering through the canopy. Then he pointed. "That way. 2 hours if we don't stop." Felipe, the mapmaker, scoffed. "That's northwest." The hacienda is southeast from here, the boy's guessing. But Don Hernan, desperate, overruled him. Let the boy lead. Mateo led them home in 90 minutes, taking shortcuts the officers would never have found, reading the landscape like text on a page. He noted where moss grew thickest on trees, indicating north. He observed the direction water flowed in tiny streams. He measured distances with his eyes in a way that seemed almost supernatural, but wasn't. It was simply observation so acute, it appeared magical to those who'd never needed to develop it. The general arrived at the hacienda impressed and curious. Over dinner, he asked Don Hernan about the boy. Can he read? No, General. He's never been taught. Can he do mathematics? I wouldn't know. The general sat back in his chair, fingers drumming on the table. I wonder what he could do with proper tools. What began as idle curiosity became an experiment that would alter several lives irrevocably. General Alvarez decided to extend his stay. He had Felipe bring Mateo to the hacienda's library, a dusty room Don Hernan rarely used, and spread a military map across the table. It showed the region around Lima, with mountains, rivers, roads, and settlements marked in careful detail. Tell me what you see, the general said. Mateo stared at the map for a long moment. His finger traced the blue lines representing rivers. Water flows down, he said quietly. These lines, they're rivers? Yes. The boy's eyes lit with understanding. His finger moved to the concentric circles marking elevation. And these are hills? Mountains? Correct. For the next hour, Felipe watched in astonishment as Mateo decoded the map's symbolic language through pure logic and observation. The boy had never seen a map before, yet he grasped its principles faster than cadets who'd studied for months. The general saw potential. He saw a tool. Over the following weeks, an arrangement took shape. Don Hernan, eager to maintain the general's goodwill and seeing no value in a slave's unusual skill, agreed to lend Mateo to the military. The boy would be taken to Lima, to the general's residence, where he would assist with cartographic work. It was temporary, the general assured, a few months at most. Mateo was 12 years old when they took him from the only home he'd known. He never saw the hacienda again. In Lima, Mateo entered a world of maps. The general's residence included a dedicated cartography room where military campaigns were planned, territorial surveys compiled, and strategic routes plotted. Felipe worked there alongside 2 other military mapmakers, preparing charts for Spain's colonial operations across South America. Mateo's initial role was menial, cleaning inkwells, preparing parchment, organizing reference materials. But he watched. He absorbed. And when Felipe noticed the boy studying a half-finished map of the Andes mountain passes, he made a decision that would haunt him later. He began teaching Mateo properly. It started with basic concepts, scale, orientation, symbols. But Mateo's progress was explosive. Within 3 months, he could interpret complex topographical surveys. Within 6, he was spotting errors in maps drawn by trained professionals. Within a year, he was solving problems that stumped the military's official cartographers. The general recognized what he had. Mateo became an unofficial member of the mapping team. Unofficial because acknowledging a slave's intellectual contribution would undermine the entire social order that sustained colonial power. Here's how it worked. Officers would present mapping challenges to Felipe's team. Felipe would discreetly show the materials to Mateo. Mateo would provide solutions. Felipe would present those solutions as his own work. The general would praise Felipe's brilliance. Everyone benefited, everyone except Mateo. The boy worked in a windowless back room, surrounded by maps of places he would never visit, solving geographical puzzles that would guide military campaigns he would never participate in. His recommendations influenced troop movements, supply routes, and strategic planning across the viceroyalty. He was 13 years old and already shaping colonial warfare. But there were rules. Strict, unbreakable rules. Mateo could study maps under supervision. He could draw on practice parchment. He could discuss cartographic theory with Felipe in private. But he was never allowed to keep maps overnight. Never allowed to carry them outside the cartography room. And most peculiarly, never allowed to hold a compass. This last rule came directly from General Alvarez. A compass grants autonomy, the general explained to Felipe during one of their evening consultations. A slave with map-reading skills and a compass could navigate anywhere, could escape to territories beyond our reach. We benefit from his mind, but we must never give him the means to use it independently. So Mateo learned to work without the fundamental tool of his craft. He memorized magnetic declinations. He calculated bearings mentally. He oriented maps using only the position of the sun, the time of day, and mathematical reasoning. He became exceptional at navigation precisely because he was denied its most basic instrument. By 1789, Mateo was 17. His reputation, carefully attributed to Felipe and the mapping team, had grown within military circles. The Viceroyalty of Peru faced increasing logistical challenges. Indigenous resistance in remote regions, difficult terrain hindering supply lines, inaccurate maps leading to failed expeditions. Then came the commission that would change everything. A Spanish military force was being assembled to establish a new outpost in the Amazonian foothills, a strategic location meant to secure territorial claims and suppress local resistance. The region was poorly mapped. Previous expeditions had lost men to disease, hostile encounters, and, most frequently, simply getting lost in the labyrinth of rivers, canyons, and dense forest. General Alvarez was tasked with creating reliable maps for the operation. The commission came from the Viceroy himself. Success would mean prestige and promotion. Failure would mean professional disgrace. The general summoned his team. He gave them 6 weeks to produce comprehensive maps of a region most considered unmappable. Felipe, now in his 40s and aware his actual skills fell short of his reputation, turned to Mateo. "Can it be done?" he asked the young man in the quiet of the cartography room. Mateo studied the fragmentary, contradictory existing maps of the region. Missionary reports, indigenous testimonies collected by force, rough sketches from traders. He spread them across the work table, comparing, cross-referencing, identifying patterns. "The river system is the key," he said finally. "Everything connects to water. If we map the watersheds correctly, the rest follows. Can you do it without surveying the territory yourself?" Mateo was quiet for a long moment. "I can create something better than what exists. But I'll need access to every recorded observation, every traveler's account, every missionary log. And I'll need time." They gave him 5 weeks. Felipe obtained every scrap of geographical information about the region from military archives, church records, and trading company files. Mateo worked 16-hour days, synthesizing contradictory data, applying logical principles to resolve discrepancies, filling gaps with calculated projections based on geological patterns. He created a masterpiece. The map Mateo produced, credited of course to Felipe and the military cartography department, showed the Amazonian foothills with unprecedented accuracy. He deduced the locations of rapids, identified navigable channels, predicted seasonal flooding zones, and marked strategic high points for potential outposts, all without ever setting foot in the region. When the military expedition set out, they carried copies of Mateo's map. They returned 4 months later, having successfully established the outpost with minimal casualties. The expedition commander reported that the maps had been extraordinarily accurate, almost uncannily so. The Viceroy personally commended General Alvarez. Felipe received a promotion and salary increase. Don Hernan, still technically Mateo's owner, was paid a modest consulting fee. Mateo received nothing, not even acknowledgement. But something had shifted. The general began looking at the young man differently, with an unsettling mixture of pride and fear. Success bred demand. Officers who'd heard of the accurate maps requested Felipe's services. The general, now promoted to a senior administrative position, formalized the arrangement. Felipe's cartography department, which meant Mateo, would serve the Viceroyalty's military operations exclusively. For Mateo, now 18, this meant even longer hours, even more complex challenges, even deeper isolation. He rarely left the cartography room. His world consisted of parchment, ink, second-hand observations, and mental calculations. While other slaves in Lima might at least walk through markets or see the ocean, Matteo saw only paper representations of places he could never visit. The irony was suffocating. He was creating the very maps that allowed others their freedom of movement while being denied movement himself. Felipe, to his credit, felt increasing guilt. He'd become wealthy and respected for work that wasn't truly his. Late at night, after wine, he would sometimes sit with Matteo and discuss cartography as equals, teacher and student becoming colleagues. "You could be the greatest map maker in the Americas," Felipe told him once, "if circumstances were different. But they aren't," Matteo replied without bitterness. It was simply fact. During one of these conversations, Felipe made a dangerous offer. "I could teach you to use a compass." In secret. Matteo looked at him for a long time. The general would find out eventually, and then neither of us would be safe. "You deserve to at least hold one, to understand the instrument completely." "I already understand it," Matteo said quietly. "I don't need to hold it to know how it works." But the truth was more complicated. Matteo desperately wanted to hold a compass, not for practical reasons, he'd learned to work around its absence, but for symbolic ones. A compass represented autonomy, agency, the power to determine one's own direction, everything he didn't have. The prohibition had become a psychological cage more constraining than any physical chain. In 1792, during a brief period of diplomatic cooperation between Spain and Britain, a British naval officer named Captain Thomas Graves arrived in Lima to discuss maritime charts and coastal mapping. He was a fellow of the Royal Society, educated at Oxford, and considered an expert in nautical navigation. General Alvarez, eager to demonstrate Spanish cartographic sophistication, invited Captain Graves to review some of the military's recent mapping work, specifically the Amazonian foothills maps that had proven so successful. Graves studied them with professional interest, then astonishment. "These watershed projections," he said, pointing to Matteo's work. "This is extraordinarily advanced theoretical cartography. The hydrological modeling alone would challenge our best men at the Admiralty. Who made these calculations?" "Our cartography department," the general replied smoothly, led by Felipe Cortez. Graves requested a meeting with Felipe. The meeting was arranged in the cartography room. Felipe, nervous, tried to answer Graves' technical questions. He managed adequately on basic points but faltered on the theoretical foundations. The British captain's expression shifted from respect to confusion. "I don't mean to be indelicate," Graves said carefully, "but these maps suggest a level of theoretical understanding that seems inconsistent with your explanations." Felipe's face reddened. In the corner of the room, Matteo was organizing parchment, apparently paying no attention, but his hands had stopped moving. An uncomfortable silence stretched. The general, sensing exposure, intervened. "Captain Graves, our methods are perhaps different from British approaches. We value practical results over theoretical discourse." Graves wasn't fooled, but he was diplomatic enough not to press further in that moment. However, over the following days, he made discreet inquiries. He spoke with junior officers. He examined the workflow of the cartography department. He noted who spent the most time in the mapping room, who had ink-stained fingers, who understood the work's actual depth. He noticed Matteo. One afternoon, when Felipe was called away to a meeting, Graves found himself alone in the cartography room with the young slave. Matteo was working on coastal charts, cross-referencing tidal patterns with lunar cycles. "You're the one who made the Amazonian maps," Graves said quietly. "Not a question." Matteo's hand froze above the parchment. He didn't look up. "I'm just a copyist, sir." "No, you're not." Graves moved closer. "Those watershed calculations require understanding of fluid dynamics, geological surveying, and predictive modeling. That's not copying. That's original cartographic theory." Matteo remained silent. "How old are you?" 19, I think. "And you've never held a compass?" Finally, Matteo looked up. "Never, sir." Graves reached into his coat and removed his personal compass, a beautiful brass instrument with glass face and carved wooden case. He set it on the table between them. "Go ahead." Matteo stared at the compass like it might bite him. His hands trembled slightly. "I'm not permitted. I'm giving you permission. With respect, Captain. It's not your permission to give." They stood in tense silence. Graves eventually pocketed the compass, his expression troubled. But before leaving, he said something that would plant a seed in Matteo's mind. There are places in this world where a man is valued for his mind, not his legal status. England has freed slaves. So has France in their fashion. This system you're trapped in, it's not universal. It's not eternal. After Graves left, Matteo returned to his charts. But his hands shook for hours afterward. The compass he'd been denied had suddenly become a symbol of an entirely different kind of freedom. Captain Graves departed Lima, but he'd left disruption in his wake. Felipe couldn't meet the Englishman's eyes after their uncomfortable meeting. The general became paranoid about operational security. And Matteo had started to dream differently, not of escape. The practical difficulties were immense, but of recognition, of agency, of a life where his work belonged to him. He began a secret project. Late at night, after the household slept, Matteo would take discarded parchment scraps, materials too damaged or stained for official use, and work by candlelight in his quarters. He was creating a personal map, not of military routes or colonial territories, but of the world as he understood it from thousands of hours studying other people's geographical work. He'd never seen the ocean, yet he mapped coastlines from naval charts. He'd never crossed mountains, yet he drew the Andes with detailed precision from survey data. He'd never left Peru, yet he charted South America, the Caribbean, the Atlantic crossing to Africa and Europe. It was his act of intellectual resistance, claiming ownership, however private, of knowledge they'd forced him to generate but never allowed him to possess. The map was beautiful, meticulous. It incorporated corrections to official charts, filled gaps in existing knowledge, represented thousands of hours of accumulated expertise. He drew it in sections on separate small parchments that he could easily hide. He told no one, not Felipe, who might have been sympathetic, not the other slaves who wouldn't understand. The map was his alone. For nearly a year, Matteo worked on his secret project. It grew more detailed, more comprehensive. He'd created what might have been the most accurate map of South America existing in 1793, and it was hidden under the floorboards of a slave quarter, known to no one. Then Don Hernan sold him. Financial desperation has its own logic. Don Hernan's debts had finally consumed him. The hacienda would be seized by creditors. He needed to liquidate assets quickly, quietly, before legal proceedings made it impossible. Matteo, despite the informal arrangement with General Alvarez, was still legally Don Hernan's property, and property could be sold. The buyer was a mining company operating in the northern highlands near Cajamarca. They needed laborers for dangerous work in silver mines. They paid immediately, in hard currency, no questions asked. The general was traveling when the sale occurred. By the time he returned to Lima and discovered what had happened, Matteo was already 3 days into a mule train convoy heading north, a journey that would take 2 weeks across some of the most treacherous terrain in the Andes. Felipe was devastated. "We have to get him back," he told the general. "His knowledge is replaceable." The general interrupted, though his expression suggested he didn't believe it. "He's a slave, Felipe. Don Hernan had every legal right to sell him. But the work, you'll continue the work you managed before the boy arrived." They both knew this was a lie. Felipe's recent successes had all depended on Matteo's insights. Without him, the quality would deteriorate immediately. But colonial law was absolute. A slave was property. Property followed its owner's interests. Felipe made a desperate decision. He rode north following the convoy route, traveling hard for 4 days until he caught up with the mule train at a mountain way station. He offered the mining company's transport supervisor double what they'd paid for Matteo, using his own savings, the money he'd earned from work that wasn't his. The supervisor refused. "We paid for laborers. We deliver laborers. Company policy." Felipe tried bribery. He tried appeals to reason. He tried everything short of armed robbery. Nothing worked. On the 5th morning, the convoy departed before dawn, while Felipe slept fitfully at the way station's inn. By the time he woke, they were hours ahead. He didn't have the funds to chase them further. He didn't have the authority to commandeer them. He rode back to Lima defeated, knowing he'd just lost the mind behind his success. He never forgave himself. The mines consumed people. That's what they were designed to do. Men entered vertical shafts carved into mountain rock, descended by rope and ladder into darkness, and extracted silver ore in conditions that killed them slowly, through lung disease, or quickly through collapse, flooding, or bad air. The mining company expected 3 to 5 years of labor from each worker before death or disability made them worthless. Mateo arrived at the mining camp understanding he'd been sent to die. The camp overseer, a man named Diego, processed new arrivals with bureaucratic efficiency. Names were recorded. Work assignments distributed. Mateo was assigned to Shaft 7, Deep Extraction Crew, starting the next morning. That night, in the cramped workers' barracks, Mateo lay awake thinking about the map hidden under the floorboards in Lima. His life's work, created in secret, now abandoned and likely lost forever. He thought about the hundreds of maps he'd studied, the landscapes he'd learned to read like literature, the geographical knowledge trapped uselessly inside his head. He thought about the compass he'd never been allowed to hold. In the morning he would descend into darkness. In a few years, likely less, he would die there, unmembered, with all his knowledge buried with him. But fate had a different plan. Mateo lasted 3 months in the deep shafts, 3 months of darkness, dust, and back-breaking labor that left his lungs burning and his body weakened. The work was assigned with brutal randomness. Teams rotated between shafts, between depths, between tasks. On a Tuesday morning in August, Mateo was assigned to Shaft 12, an older tunnel that had recently been extended deeper into the mountain. The geological survey suggested rich silver deposits in the new section. 40 men descended that morning. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, the tunnel collapsed. The sound was like thunder compressed into stone. Support timbers splintered. Rock fell in cascading waves. Men screamed. Dust filled the air so thickly it became unbreathable. When the chaos settled, 12 men were confirmed dead, crushed or suffocated in the initial collapse. The remaining 28 were trapped behind tons of fallen rock, in complete darkness, with limited air. Panic spread immediately. Some men clawed at the rockfall with bare hands, achieving nothing but torn flesh. Others prayed. Some simply sat in shocked silence. Mateo, pressed against the tunnel's far wall by the surge of fleeing workers, had avoided the falling rock. His mind, trained to analyze patterns and spatial relationships, clicked into a different mode. He began mapping the situation mentally. The tunnel had collapsed roughly 60 meters from the shaft entrance. They were approximately 90 meters below ground level. The main shaft was blocked, but mines this old often had exploratory side tunnels, abandoned attempts to find ore veins that had led nowhere. Mateo moved through the darkness, feeling along the tunnel walls, counting steps, measuring distances with his body. The other trapped men watched him with confusion or ignored him entirely. Then he found it. A side passage, partially blocked by debris but not completely sealed. It angled upward, which meant it might connect to older, higher tunnel networks. "There's a passage here," Mateo called out. Narrow but open. One of the trapped miners, a man named Paulo, approached. "That's a dead end. I've worked this shaft for 2 years. That tunnel goes nowhere. Have you explored its full length?" "Didn't need to. It's marked as abandoned." "Abandoned might mean it connects to something else," Mateo said. "Something older that's not on the current mine maps." The men debated. Oxygen was limited. Rescue from above would take days, if it came at all. Company policy generally prioritized sealing collapsed shafts over risky rescue operations. Some men advocated waiting. Others wanted to try clearing the rockfall. Mateo advocated for the side passage. "I've studied underground survey maps in Lima," he said, not mentioning why or how. "These mountains are riddled with old Spanish mining tunnels from the previous century. They're not always documented. If this passage connects to that network, it might lead to an exit. And if it doesn't," someone challenged, "then we die having tried instead of waiting to suffocate." 14 men chose to follow Mateo into the dark passage. The other 14 chose to wait for rescue that might never come. They would never see each other again. The side tunnel was barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Matteo led, feeling his way in absolute darkness, making decisions at every junction based on spatial memory, air currents, and logical deduction. He couldn't see, but he could map. His mind constructed a three-dimensional model of the passages as they moved. When the tunnel branched, he chose directions based on upward slope, air quality, and the principle that older tunnels would be higher in the mountain. When passages narrowed dangerously, he assessed whether the risk of continuing outweighed the certainty of death by waiting. The men behind him had no choice but to trust completely. They couldn't see his reasoning. They could only follow. Hours passed in claustrophobic darkness. Some men wanted to turn back. Paolo, who'd initially doubted, now found himself defending Matteo's choices. "He's gotten us this far. We keep going." They crawled through passages barely tall enough for movement. They squeezed through gaps that scraped skin from their backs. They climbed vertical shafts using ancient rotted rope that somehow still held weight. Matteo navigated through unseen space using only logic, memory, and the geographical intuition he'd spent years developing. After what felt like an eternity, later estimated at 14 hours, they saw light, not daylight, but the grey pre-dawn glow of sky visible through a collapsed tunnel entrance, overgrown with vegetation, clearly abandoned for decades. They emerged one by one onto a mountainside far from the main mining operation, disoriented, injured, exhausted, but alive. 14 men had followed a slave into unknown darkness and emerged because he'd read an invisible map in his mind. They would never forget it. The survivors made their way back to the mining camp over 2 days. They arrived to find the rescue operation still underway at Shaft 12 and still unsuccessful. The rockfall was too extensive. The company had already written off the trapped workers as lost. Then Matteo and his group appeared, alive and walking, from a completely different section of the mountain. The story spread instantly through the camp. The slave who'd navigated them to safety through unmapped tunnels, the young man who could see in darkness, who could map spaces he'd never seen, who'd saved 14 lives through pure spatial intelligence. Diego, the camp overseer, faced an unusual problem. Matteo had demonstrated extraordinary value, but the kind of value that made him dangerous. A slave who could navigate complex underground systems without maps or light was a slave who could escape anywhere, who could guide others to freedom through routes no one could follow. And there was another complication. The 14 men Matteo had saved now felt loyalty to him. Several were free workers, not slaves. They spoke openly about his intelligence, his courage, his leadership in crisis. This was profoundly destabilizing to the camp's social order. Diego wrote to the mining company's Lima office, explaining the situation and requesting guidance. The response took 3 weeks. When it arrived, it was brief. Retain the slave for potential underground navigation support, but restrict all unsupervised movement. The asset's value is matched by its risk profile. Matteo was removed from mining labor and assigned to a new role, assisting with tunnel safety surveys and route planning for new shaft development. He would help the company extract wealth more efficiently, while being watched constantly to prevent him from leaving. He'd traded one prison for another, slightly more comfortable one. But word of what had happened reached Lima, and General Alvarez began to worry. General Alvarez understood before others did. Matteo had become famous in a dangerous way. The story of the Cajamarca mine rescue circulated through military and administrative circles. Officers asked questions. Who was this slave with such extraordinary navigation skills? Where had he learned cartography? Wait, wasn't the general's cartography department involved with someone matching that description? The general saw the pattern forming. If Matteo became too well known, people would start asking whose work Felipe had really been presenting. The success story the general had built his recent promotion on would unravel. Questions would be asked about using slave labor for military intelligence work. Complications would arise. Worse, from the general's perspective, was the philosophical problem. The entire justification for slavery rested on the presumed intellectual inferiority of the enslaved. A slave who demonstrably exceeded the cognitive abilities of trained military professionals threatened the ideological foundation of the system itself. Matteo needed to be controlled, or disappeared. Or both. The general dispatched a trusted officer to Cajamarca with specific instructions. Purchase Matteo from the mining company, transport him back to Lima, and confine him to the military cartography department under strict supervision. No more public demonstrations of skill. No more situations where he might gain recognition or autonomy. Keep him useful. Keep him invisible. Keep him controlled. The officer arrived at the mining camp in October 1792. Diego, the overseer, was happy to sell. Matteo had proven useful, but the constant surveillance he required consumed resources. The transaction was completed. Matteo was informed he was returning to Lima, back to map work, back to the cartography room. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt the walls closing in. The return journey to Lima took 11 days. Matteo traveled in a guarded convoy, treated neither as prisoner nor passenger but something in between, a valuable object being transported carefully. He had time to think, about the years spent creating maps that bore other men's names, about the compass he'd still never held, about Captain Graves's words. There are places where a man is valued for his mind, not his legal status. About the fact that his extraordinary talent had only ever secured him more refined forms of captivity. When they reached Lima, he was taken directly to the general's residence. Not to the cartography room, but to the general's private office, a conversation that would be recorded in no official documents. General Alvarez sat behind his desk, studying the young man he'd shaped into a weapon he couldn't fully control. "You saved lives at Cajamarca," the general began, "demonstrated remarkable ability. I'm told men speak of you with admiration." Matteo said nothing. "This creates complications. You understand why?" "Yes, sir. Your value to me, to the Crown's interests, depends on discretion, on your work remaining properly attributed, on you remaining exactly where you belong in the social order." "I understand, sir." The general leaned forward. "Do you? Because I wonder if your time away has given you ideas. If conversations with British officers or grateful miners have made you forget your position." Matteo met his eyes. "I've forgotten nothing, General. Not my position. Not who benefits from my work. Not who receives credit while I receive quarters and meals. I've forgotten nothing." The honesty was dangerous, but Matteo was tired of pretending. The general's expression hardened. "You'll return to the cartography department. Felipe will supervise you directly. You will not speak to visiting officers. You will not discuss your work outside the mapping room. You will create, and others will claim creation. This is the arrangement. It is not negotiable." "And if I refuse to work?" The silence that followed was suffocating. "Then you return to the mines," the general said quietly. "Or somewhere worse. Your choice is not whether to work, Matteo. It's whether to work here, using your mind, or work elsewhere, destroying your body. I'd prefer the former. It's more profitable for both of us, but I'm content with either." Matteo understood perfectly. Comply or be discarded. He returned to the cartography room the next morning. The following year was productive and poisonous. Matteo created maps of extraordinary quality. He solved navigational problems for military operations across the viceroyalty. He trained Felipe's new assistants in techniques they didn't realize came from him. His work was used, praised, and compensated, just never with his name attached. But something inside him had broken at Cajamarca, or perhaps had clarified. He understood now with absolute certainty that his talent would never earn him freedom, that excellence would only make him more valuable as property, that the better his work, the tighter his chains. The realization was corrosive. Felipe noticed the change first. Matteo's demeanor remained professional, his work remained flawless, but the intellectual enthusiasm had vanished. The boy who once asked endless questions about cartographic theory now worked in grim silence. "Are you well?" Felipe asked one evening. "I'm functional," Matteo replied. "That's not the same thing. It's all that's required." Felipe wanted to say something comforting, that circumstances might change, that the general might eventually grant freedom, that the work mattered. But they would all be lies, and both men knew it. The cartography room, once a refuge of intellectual stimulation, became another cage. Maps covered the walls, documents of freedom and movement created by someone permitted neither. The psychological weight was crushing. In March 1794, an unexpected letter arrived at the general's residence. It was from Captain Thomas Graves, writing from London. Graves explained that he'd been appointed to a Royal Society commission studying South American geography. He was seeking the most accurate available maps of Peru and the Amazon basin for inclusion in a comprehensive atlas project. He specifically requested access to the exceptional Amazonian watershed maps he'd seen during his Lima visit, and asked whether collaboration might be possible with the cartographic expert responsible for their creation. The phrasing was deliberately careful. Graves knew or suspected who that expert was. General Alvarez read the letter 3 times, considering implications. British interest in Spanish colonial maps was politically sensitive, but the Royal Society project represented prestige. Having Spanish cartography featured prominently would be a diplomatic victory. More importantly, the general saw an opportunity. He summoned Mateo and Felipe. In his office, he laid out the situation. The British wanted the best maps available. Felipe would prepare a portfolio of work to send to London. Mateo's work, obviously, though credited to Felipe and the department. This was a significant opportunity to demonstrate Spanish cartographic superiority. "I want your finest work," the general told them. "New maps, original research. Something that will make the British envious." Felipe nodded. Mateo remained expressionless. "And Mateo," the general added, "this is your chance to contribute to something permanent. These maps will be published, studied by scholars, preserved in institutions. Your work, our work, will outlive us all." The cruelty was probably unintentional. The general genuinely believed he was offering something meaningful, immortality through work, if not through name. But Mateo heard it differently. Create your masterpiece so others can claim it eternally. Still, he agreed. What choice did he have? For 3 months, Mateo worked on what would be his greatest achievement. He compiled everything he knew about South American geography into a series of interconnected maps. Coastal charts, mountain passes, river systems, interior territories. He incorporated corrections to existing knowledge, filled gaps through logical extrapolation, and created notations explaining his methodologies. He worked with the obsessive focus of someone creating a final statement, because at some level he knew that's what this was. Felipe watched, troubled. The quality of work was stunning, but Mateo's demeanor was increasingly detached, almost mechanical. He ate little, slept less, spoke only when directly addressed. "You should rest," Felipe urged. "I'll rest when it's finished. You're pushing yourself too hard." "Does it matter? The work is what's valuable. I'm just the mechanism that produces it." Felipe had no response to that truth. By June, the portfolio was complete, 12 large-format maps representing the most sophisticated cartographic work produced in colonial Peru. They were beautiful, accurate, theoretically advanced, a landmark achievement in South American geographical knowledge. General Alvarez reviewed them with undisguised satisfaction. He had Felipe write an accompanying letter to Captain Graves describing the Spanish Royal Cartography Department's methodology and findings. Mateo's name appeared nowhere. The portfolio was packed in protective leather cases, sealed with the general's insignia, and placed on a merchant vessel bound for Cadiz, from where it would be transported to London. Mateo watched the cases being loaded onto the wagon that would take them to the port. His life's work, leaving forever, credited to others. Felipe stood beside him, unable to find adequate words. "They're beautiful maps," he finally offered. "They're just paper," Mateo replied. After the London portfolio departed, Mateo's value to the general decreased slightly. The major project was complete. Daily work returned to routine military cartography, useful but not groundbreaking. This created a dangerous situation. Mateo remained a risk without proportional benefit. The general began considering options. Perhaps sell him to another government department, perhaps send him to a distant garrison where his knowledge could be useful, but his presence forgotten. Perhaps something more permanent. Mateo sensed the shift. He'd been around military planning long enough to recognize when he was being evaluated as a problem to be solved. In August 1794, he made a decision that had been forming for months. He would attempt the impossible, not escape. He'd calculated those odds too many times and found them impossible. But something else, something that would give his work meaning on his own terms. He would create one final map, and he would sign it. The idea was simple and suicidal. He would produce a cartographic work of such exceptional quality that it couldn't be ignored, and he would mark it as his own, establishing authorship in a way that couldn't be erased or reassigned. It violated every rule of his captivity. It would almost certainly result in severe punishment, possibly death. But Matteo had reached a point where invisible survival felt more unbearable than visible destruction. He began planning his last map. Matteo chose his subject carefully, a comprehensive chart of Lima and its surrounding territories, incorporating military installations, defensive positions, supply routes, and strategic vulnerabilities. It was highly sensitive information, exactly the kind of cartographic intelligence Spain guarded carefully from rival colonial powers. Creating such a map without authorization was espionage. Signing it would be confessing to espionage. Matteo didn't care anymore. If his talent would never earn him freedom, he would at least make it undeniably his. He worked in stolen hours. After the official workday ended, he would remain in the cartography room, telling guards he was organizing materials. He used high-quality parchment acquired by claiming it was for Felipe's projects. He drew with meticulous precision, incorporating details only someone with his comprehensive knowledge could include. And in the bottom right corner, in careful script, he wrote, "Charted and drawn by Matteo Lima, Anno Domini, 1794. Not attributed to the military department, not credited to Felipe. His name, his work, finally united." The map took 6 weeks to complete. It was extraordinary, possibly the most detailed urban and regional map of Lima created during the colonial period. Military historians would later speculate it contained information that shouldn't have been accessible to any single individual, but it was never meant for military use. Matteo's plan was desperate but clear. He would attempt to get the map to British or Dutch traders operating in Lima's port. Foreign powers would pay substantially for such detailed Spanish military intelligence. The money meant nothing to him. He couldn't use it as a slave. But the map bearing his name would reach institutions beyond Spanish control, would be studied, preserved, recognized. His authorship would survive, even if he didn't. He made contact through Paulo, the miner who'd escaped Cajamarca with him and who now worked in Lima's port district. Paulo knew merchants, smugglers, people who moved information for profit. A meeting was arranged with a Dutch trading agent who dealt in sensitive materials. The exchange would happen at a warehouse near the docks, at night, with minimal witnesses. Matteo brought his map, rolled in protective cloth, his hands trembling slightly as he held his own work, truly held it as something that belonged to him for the first time. He never made it to the warehouse. The general's intelligence network in Lima was more extensive than Matteo had realized. Informants existed everywhere, among merchants, dock workers, even among slaves who traded information for small privileges. Paulo, loyal but desperate for money to support his sick wife, had mentioned Matteo's plan to someone he thought he could trust. That person mentioned it to someone else. Within 2 days, word reached the general. Soldiers arrested Matteo 3 blocks from the warehouse, the rolled map in his possession. They brought him directly to the general's residence, to the same office where his return from Cajamarca had been discussed. General Alvarez unrolled the map on his desk. His face showed no emotion as he examined the work's extraordinary detail, the sensitive military information, the signature in the corner. Charted and drawn by Matteo. "You understand this is treason," the general said finally. "It's my work," Matteo replied. "I created it. I signed it. You created it as property of the Spanish crown. Your hands, your mind, they belong to your owner. Their output belongs to your owner. You have no right to sign anything. Then I have no reason to create anything." The general stood, walked to the window overlooking Lima's plaza. "You saved men at Cajamarca. I took that into consideration. I brought you back here instead of leaving you in those mines. And this is how you repay that mercy? Mercy? Mateo's voice cracked slightly. You brought me back because I'm useful. Everything I've done for 7 years has made other men wealthy and respected while I remain property. That's not mercy, that's exploitation with better lighting. You're alive, fed, using your mind instead of breaking your back in fields. That's more than most in your position can claim. It's also less than any free man with half my ability would receive. The confrontation hung in the air, heavy with truths that couldn't coexist with the colonial order. The general returned to his desk, rolled up the map carefully. This will be destroyed. You will never attempt anything like this again. And to ensure you can't, he opened a drawer, removed a document and signed it with deliberate strokes. You're being sold to a sugar plantation in the northern coast, remote, isolated, hard labor. You'll leave tomorrow. Mateo felt something cold settle in his chest. And my cartography work? Ended. You're too dangerous to keep in Lima. Your knowledge makes you valuable, but your willingness to claim that knowledge makes you impossible to control safely. So you'll waste what I can do. I'll eliminate the risk you represent. The general's voice was final. Your talent was always secondary to your compliance. You forgot that. Guards escorted Mateo from the office. He was locked in a storage room for the night, a room he'd walked past hundreds of times but never entered. In the morning, he would begin the journey to a plantation where his mind would be irrelevant and his body slowly destroyed by cane field labor. He sat in darkness, thinking about the map that had been confiscated, the signature that would never reach the world, the years of work that had amounted to nothing he could claim. And he thought about the compass he'd never been allowed to hold, the perfect metaphor for a life spent showing others direction while being denied any of his own. Felipe learned of Mateo's impending sale from a clerk the next morning. He rushed to the general's office, furious in a way the general had never seen him. You can't send him away. The department depends on his work. The department depends on your work, Felipe, the general interrupted coldly. That's the official record. That's what will remain. It's a lie. It's necessary. Mateo attempted to sell military intelligence to foreign powers. He's a liability now. He attempted to sign his own work. That's not espionage, it's desperation. The general's eyes narrowed. You're dangerously close to insubordination. Consider your next words carefully. Felipe saw the threat. His career, his reputation, his prosperity, all built on Mateo's unacknowledged labor. If he pushed too hard, the general could destroy him too. He backed down, as he'd always backed down, as the system required him to. But that night, Felipe did something he'd never found courage for before. He went to the storage room where Mateo was confined. The guard, who knew Felipe, allowed a brief visit. Mateo sat against the wall, eyes closed, running through mental calculations of distances and directions, the habit he'd developed to calm himself. I tried to stop this, Felipe said quietly. I know. I'm sorry. For all of it. For taking credit. For not fighting harder. For being human. Mateo opened his eyes. You did what the system allowed. What it rewarded. I don't hate you for that, Felipe. I hate the system that made it rational. Felipe sat beside him on the floor, two men who'd spent years working side by side, separated by a legal status that rendered one's mind valuable and the other's disposable. I brought something, Felipe said. He reached into his coat and removed a brass compass, the department's standard-issue instrument, worn but functional. I can't give you freedom. I can't give you recognition. But I can break this one stupid rule. He placed the compass in Mateo's palm. Mateo stared at it. The weight of it. The simple mechanical beauty. The needle swinging to point north, unerring, automatic, free. His hands closed around it carefully, as if holding something sacred. For several minutes, he just sat there, feeling the compass's weight, watching the needle settle, experiencing the physical reality of the tool he'd only ever understood abstractly. Thank you, he whispered finally. Felipe stayed with him for another hour. They didn't discuss the past or the impossible future. They simply sat together, two men briefly equal in the presence of a forbidden instrument. When Felipe left, he didn't ask for the compass back. It was the only gift he could give. Morning came too quickly. Mateo was placed in a wagon with 6 other slaves being transported to northern plantations. The journey would take approximately 2 weeks, following coastal roads through desert regions where escape would mean death by exposure. He carried nothing except the clothes he wore and, hidden in the band of his pants, Felipe's compass. The first 3 days were uneventful. The wagon moved north, stopping at way stations at night. Guards were professional but not cruel. The other slaves were mostly silent, lost in their own despair. Mateo spent the hours studying the landscape, comparing what he saw to mental maps he'd created from documents. The coastal desert of Peru, beautiful and lethal. Mountains to the east, ocean to the west. Nothing but sand and scattered vegetation between. On the 4th night, they stopped at a way station near a fishing village. The guards drank heavily, cheap pisco purchased from the village. By midnight, 2 were unconscious, 1 was vomiting, and the 4th was barely coherent. Escape became possible. The other slaves noticed too. One of them, a woman named Rosa, whispered, "We could run into the hills." "We'd die of thirst in 2 days," another replied, "better than the plantations." They debated in urgent whispers. Mateo listened, calculating. The nearest town where they might find help was 30 kilometers south. There were scattered settlements in the foothills, but reaching them required crossing waterless terrain. The ocean was close, but going to the fishing village meant being immediately identified and returned. Rosa looked at Mateo. "You navigated those mines. Can you get us somewhere safe?" He wanted to say yes, wanted to believe his skills could save them all. But cartography on paper was different from survival navigation in reality. He had no water, no supplies, no real knowledge of safe routes in this specific area. His expertise was theoretical, derived from maps, not lived experience. "I don't know," he admitted. "I can read maps, but I've never actually traveled these routes. Everything I know is second-hand. But you could try." He could. And they would follow him, trusting his reputation. And when they died in the desert because his theoretical knowledge proved insufficient, their deaths would be his responsibility, or he could do nothing. Wait for morning. Continue to the plantation. Survive for however long his body held out. The compass pressed against his skin, a small circle of metal and possibility. Mateo made a decision that surprised him. "I'm not running, but anyone who wants to should go now, while the guards are useless." "You're staying?" Rosa couldn't believe it. "My knowledge comes from maps I can't access out here. I'd be leading you blind." "That's not navigation. It's guessing. And guessing gets people killed." 3 of the other slaves decided to run anyway. They disappeared into the darkness, heading for the hills. Rosa stayed, as did 2 men who recognized Mateo's logic. The next morning, the guards discovered the escape. They were furious, terrified of consequences. The wagon continued north with a diminished group. They never learned whether the 3 who ran survived or perished. Mateo suspected he'd made the cowardly choice, preserving himself while others risked everything. But he'd also made the honest one, acknowledging the limits of his knowledge instead of pretending to certainties he didn't possess. It would be the last time he'd have that choice to make. The sugar plantation occupied a coastal valley where the climate shifted from desert to humid tropical. Endless fields of cane stretched toward mountains that always seemed impossibly distant. The labor was exactly what Mateo had feared. Brutal, repetitive, designed to extract maximum productivity before workers collapsed. He lasted 18 months. His body, conditioned by years of intellectual work rather than physical labor, deteriorated rapidly under the plantation's demands. His hands, once steady enough to draw minute cartographic details, became swollen and scarred from machete work. His lungs, already damaged from the Cajamarca mines, worsened in the humid air thick with cane pollen. The plantation's overseer recognized Mateo was dying slowly and didn't care. Workers were replaceable. The plantation economy ran on consumption of human beings, but Mateo still had the compass. He'd hidden it successfully through countless inspections and searches. At night, in the suffocating quarters he shared with 40 other slaves, he would remove it and hold it in the darkness. Not to plan escape. He was too weak now and the geography too hostile. But as a reminder, a reminder that he'd once used his mind for something more than surviving the next day, that he'd created works of value, even if others claimed them, that he'd held knowledge that generals had relied upon. The compass was proof he'd been more than what he'd been reduced to. Other slaves noticed his nightly ritual, the way he'd cradle something in his hands they couldn't see. Some thought it was a religious medallion. Others thought he'd lost his mind. One old woman named Beatrice recognized it as something else. "That's what keeps you alive," she observed one night. "It's just a compass." "No, it's a choice you made once. Holding it reminds you that you've made choices." She was right. In an existence stripped of agency, the compass represented the last fragment of autonomy. The memory of a moment when Felipe had acknowledged his humanity by breaking a rule. What Matteo didn't know, couldn't know, was that his maps had arrived in London and caused something approaching cartographic sensation. Captain Graves presented them to the Royal Society's Geography Commission. The members examined them with growing amazement. The theoretical sophistication, the innovative notation systems, the accuracy that exceeded contemporary British work in several areas. This wasn't merely competent Spanish cartography. This was genius-level geographical analysis. Graves, in his presentation, had carefully mentioned that he believed the work originated with an unconventional member of the Spanish mapping department whose specific identity remains unclear. He'd planted a seed of curiosity without making accusations that might cause diplomatic friction. The Royal Society requested permission to publish the maps in their upcoming atlas, with proper attribution to creators. They wrote to General Alvarez, asking for clarification on authorship, so appropriate credit could be assigned. The general received this letter in September 1795. He responded with bureaucratic vagueness. The maps were produced by the Royal Spanish Cartography Department under military supervision, with no specific individuals named. The British, frustrated but diplomatic, published the maps in early 1796 with attribution to Spanish Military Survey, Lima, Peru, Cartographer unknown. Unknown. The perfect epitaph for Matteo's life's work. But Graves didn't stop. He'd been genuinely moved by the cartographic brilliance and troubled by the mystery. He wrote again to the general, more directly this time, mentioning, "The young man I briefly met in your cartography room in 1792, I believe his contribution deserves recognition." This letter alarmed the general considerably. The British were asking uncomfortable questions. Other officers in Lima had heard rumors. The story of Cajamarca mine rescue occasionally resurfaced. Connections were being made. Matteo, even absent, had become a problem again. In November 1795, General Alvarez sent instructions to the sugar plantation. The slave Matteo was no longer needed. He could be disposed of through standard processes. A euphemism with grim implications. The plantation overseer received these instructions without particular interest. Workers died frequently enough that one more casualty would barely be noticed. Matteo's death was scheduled to look like a field accident. But Felipe had been intercepting the general's correspondence. Not systematically, he wasn't organized enough for proper espionage. But he'd developed a habit of reviewing outgoing letters, ostensibly to check for cartographic references that might require his department's attention. In reality, he was watching for anything involving Matteo. When he saw the coded instruction regarding disposal, he understood immediately. Felipe had spent 3 years living with guilt. 3 years accepting praise for work that wasn't his. 3 years complicit in a system that had destroyed someone with more talent in one hand than Felipe possessed in his entire body. He'd reached his own breaking point. Felipe took an enormous risk. He went to the Viceroy's office, not to the general, but directly to the Viceroy's administrative staff, and requested an audience regarding irregularities in military cartography operations. The request was unusual enough to be granted. 3 days later, Felipe stood before Viceroy Don Ambrosio O'Higgins, one of the most powerful men in Spanish America. What Felipe did next was professional suicide and moral necessity. He told the truth. He explained that the celebrated cartographic work credited to the military department had largely been produced by an enslaved man of extraordinary ability. He described Mateo's contributions in detail. He presented evidence. Early draft maps in Mateo's handwriting, calculation sheets, comparative analysis showing quality deterioration in recent work without Mateo's involvement. He confessed his own complicity, and he revealed that this valuable asset was being disposed of at that moment at a plantation in the north. The viceroy listened with an expression that gave nothing away. When Felipe finished, there was a long silence. "You realize," the viceroy said finally, "that you've just destroyed your own career." "Yes, Your Excellence." "Why?" Felipe had asked himself that question countless times. "Because I couldn't live with being the last person who could have saved him and chose not to." The viceroy considered this. Don Ambrosio O'Higgins was himself of Irish origin, an outsider who'd risen through Spanish colonial administration despite prejudices. He understood, perhaps better than most, the arbitrariness of social hierarchies. "This creates a significant problem," he said. "If what you're telling me is accurate, we have a matter of misappropriated intellectual labor, potential security breaches, and administrative irregularities involving a senior military officer." He paused, then added, "It's also an opportunity." The viceroy moved with surprising speed. Within hours, he dispatched a courier on the fastest horse in Lima with orders to the northern plantation. Cease any disciplinary actions involving the slave Mateo, pending administrative review. But the plantation was 12 days away by normal travel. The courier would need to ride brutally hard, changing horses at military way stations to make it in 8 days. The timeline was desperately tight. Meanwhile, at the plantation, the overseer had received General Alvarez's instructions and planned accordingly. Mateo would have a tragic accident in the cane processing area, crushed by machinery, a sadly common occurrence. It was scheduled for the end of the week, 4 days before the viceroy's courier could possibly arrive. Mateo knew nothing of any of this. He worked his assigned rows, his body failing incrementally each day, holding on to life through sheer stubborn will and the nightly ritual with his hidden compass. On Thursday morning, the day marked for his orchestrated death, he was called to the processing facility. The overseer explained that a mechanical problem needed assessment, and Mateo's careful eye was requested. It was a thin pretense, but what choice did he have except follow? The processing facility was a nightmare of iron machinery, steam, and crushing gears. Workers fed cane into rollers that extracted juice with tremendous pressure. Accidents happened frequently. Hands crushed, arms caught in gears, bodies pulled into mechanisms that couldn't be stopped quickly. The overseer led Mateo toward a particularly dangerous roller system that was malfunctioning. As they approached, Mateo noticed 2 things. The machinery wasn't actually broken, and the workers who normally operated this section had been sent away. He understood instantly. His heart rate spiked. His mind, trained to calculate escape routes and navigation paths, analyzed the space frantically, exit routes blocked. Overseer positioning himself behind, 2 other men approaching from the sides. Not workers, but enforcers. This was the moment. Either die pretending ignorance or die fighting. Mateo chose a third option. He ran. Not toward exits they'd blocked, but toward the one space they hadn't considered. He dove between moving machinery components, squeezing through a gap between roller and frame that seemed impossibly narrow. His emaciated body, wrecked by plantation labor, was just small enough to fit. He felt something tear in his shoulder as he forced himself through. Heard shouting behind him. Emerged on the other side of the machinery complex into the outdoor loading area, and ran toward the cane fields, the vast, confusing maze where he might have advantage. The overseer and his men pursued, but Mateo knew something they didn't. He'd spent 18 months observing this plantation's geography. He knew which field sections connected to irrigation channels, which paths led to dead ends, which areas had dense growth that could hide a running man. He navigated the plantation like he'd navigated Cajamarca's tunnels, by reading a mental map no one else could see. For 6 hours he evaded capture, weak, injured, exhausted, but free in a way he'd never been. Every direction his own choice. Every turn his decision. He was found at sunset, collapsed near the plantation's southern boundary, too depleted to continue. The overseer's men dragged him back, furious at the trouble he'd caused. Tomorrow, the overseer promised. No more chances, but tomorrow would be too late. The viceroy's courier reached the plantation at dawn on Friday, exactly when Mateo was being led back toward the processing facility for his second scheduled accident. The courier, a young officer named Antonio, rode into the plantation compound with the viceroy's seal prominently displayed, shouting for the overseer with the authority of someone who carried power beyond his rank. By order of Viceroy O'Higgins, all actions regarding the slave Mateo are suspended pending administrative review. The overseer, caught mid-procedure, had no choice but to comply. Vice-regal orders superseded even General Alvarez's instructions. Mateo, bleeding from his shoulder injury and barely conscious, was detained in a locked storage room. Not as punishment now, but as protective custody, until the matter could be officially resolved. Antonio assessed the situation, realized this was far more complicated than a simple administrative review, and sent word back to Lima. Subject secured, but situation requires direct vice-regal intervention. For 2 weeks, Mateo existed in bureaucratic limbo. He was treated for his injuries, fed adequately, kept isolated. No one explained what was happening or why. He assumed it was a postponement, not a reprieve. That eventually the system would correct this anomaly and he'd return to the trajectory the general had set. He didn't allow himself to hope. In Lima, the viceroy faced a delicate political problem. On one hand, General Alvarez, a respected military officer with connections who'd been embarrassed by Felipe's revelations and was demanding the matter be dropped. On the other hand, compelling evidence of an enslaved man possessing extraordinary intellectual abilities that had materially benefited Spanish colonial operations while receiving no recognition and nearly being murdered for attempting to claim authorship. The case touched on uncomfortable questions about labor, merit, and the foundations of colonial hierarchy. A lesser administrator might have buried the matter quietly, but O'Higgins saw an opportunity that aligned with his political instincts. He was already unpopular with conservative elements for various reforms. One more controversy wouldn't significantly worsen his position. And there was propaganda value in demonstrating enlightened colonial governance. In December 1795, the viceroy issued a formal decision. Mateo would be purchased from his current owner by the vice-regal administration. He would be reassigned to the Royal Cartography Office, a civilian department, not military. His work would be appropriately credited going forward, and after 5 years of service, he would be granted manumission, legal freedom. It wasn't immediate freedom. It wasn't justice for the years already stolen, but it was more than anyone expected. General Alvarez was quietly reprimanded for administrative irregularities, but faced no serious consequences. Felipe was transferred to a different department, a lateral move that effectively ended his cartographic career, but kept him employed. And Mateo, still recovering from his injuries, learned his fate from a vice-regal administrator who traveled to the plantation to deliver the news personally. "You're being given an opportunity," the administrator explained. "Exceptional circumstances warrant exceptional measures. You'll work for 5 years, properly credited, and then receive freedom. Do you understand?" Mateo understood perfectly. He was still property, still being used for his mind. But the terms had improved dramatically. "When do I leave?" he asked. "Immediately." Mateo returned to Lima in January 1796, exactly 5 years after being taken from the hacienda as a boy. He was 21 years old, looked 40, and carried trauma in his bones from mines and plantations, and years of being simultaneously indispensable and disposable. The Royal Cartography Office was a different environment from the general's military operation. It was civilian, bureaucratic, focused on territorial administration rather than warfare. The work was less urgent, more academic. And for the first time in his life, Mateo's work would bear his name. The transition was surreal. The office director, a scholar named Don Vicente, treated him with professional courtesy. Not warmth exactly, but respect for competence. Mateo was given a workspace, proper tools, access to the archives, and a compass. His own compass. Official, registered to him for cartographic work. He held it that first day, in the office, with witnesses, legally. The symbolism was overwhelming. The instrument he'd been forbidden for 7 years, now his to use openly. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt hollow, because the prohibition had never really been about the physical compass. It had been about power, about control, about ensuring he understood his place. Giving him a compass now didn't erase the years it had been denied. It just recontextualized the cruelty. Still, he worked. What else could he do? Over the following months, Matteo produced maps for the vice-regal administration, surveys of mining districts, charts of agricultural regions, urban plans for provincial capitals. His work was credited properly in official documentation. Cartographic survey by Matteo, Royal Cartography Office. Just Matteo. Still no surname. That would require full citizenship, which manumission wouldn't automatically grant. But it was his name, attached to his work, visible. Other cartographers in the office were initially resentful of the attention he received, but his skill was undeniable. Within a year, he'd become the office's senior technical expert, consulted on the most complex projects. He was valued, compensated with better living conditions, on track for freedom in 4 more years. And he was profoundly, existentially lonely. In the cartography office worked a young surveyor named Rafael, son of a minor Spanish administrator, educated but not brilliant, competent but not exceptional. He'd initially resented Matteo's presence. The implicit comparison made his own work look pedestrian. But Rafael was also curious and decent. He began asking Matteo questions about cartographic techniques, not to take credit, but to genuinely learn. Their conversations started professionally and evolved into something resembling friendship, within the constraints that a free man and an enslaved man, even one with improved conditions, could achieve. Rafael noticed what others didn't. Matteo's technical brilliance coexisted with deep psychological damage. The way Matteo would freeze sometimes when given compass readings, as if the instrument still carried traumatic weight. The way he never kept personal possessions, as if expecting everything to be confiscated. The way he worked compulsively, unable to rest, as if productivity was the only shield against disposal. "You can slow down," Rafael told him once. "No one here will punish you for taking time. Habits are hard to break. You're safe now." "I'm useful now," Matteo corrected. "That's not the same as safe." Rafael began to understand the depth of what Matteo had experienced. The years of exploitation, the casual cruelty of being simultaneously valued and dehumanized. He did something unusual. He started advocating for Matteo in administrative discussions, arguing for better work conditions, earlier manumission, proper recognition. It was politically risky. Too much sympathy for a slave's welfare could damage one's own reputation. But Rafael persisted, and slowly, incrementally, conditions improved. Matteo was given private quarters instead of shared barracks. His food quality increased. He received payment, not a salary, but small monetary compensation for exceptional work. Coins he could actually keep. For the first time in his life, Matteo had something approaching dignity in his labor. It was strange how much that mattered, even when it came so late. The deterioration. By 1799, Matteo had completed 4 years of his 5-year term. Freedom was 10 months away, a specific date marked on administrative calendars, real and approaching. But his health was failing. Years of accumulated damage, the Cajamarca mines, the plantation labor, the chronic stress of perpetual captivity had created cascading health problems. He developed a persistent cough that wouldn't resolve. His hands shook with tremors that made detailed cartographic work increasingly difficult. He lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. The office physician examining him at Don Vicente's request was blunt. "His body is breaking down. Lungs compromised, possibly tubercular, malnutrition effects, chronic exhaustion. He needs rest, better conditions, medical treatment beyond what I can provide." "Can he continue working?" "For how long?" 10 months. The physician hesitated. "Possibly, but it's accelerating his decline." Don Vicente faced an ethical dilemma. Matteo's contracted freedom was approaching, but forcing him to continue working at full intensity might kill him before he reached that freedom. However, releasing him early required viceregal approval, a bureaucratic process that could take months. He chose a compromise, reduced Matteo's work hours, assigned him less physically demanding projects, provided better medical support. Matteo appreciated the gestures, but he understood the mathematics. His body was failing faster than the calendar moved toward freedom. He might not make it. Raphael, now Matteo's closest friend, visited him frequently during this period. They'd play chess, a game Matteo excelled at through the same spatial reasoning he applied to cartography. They'd discuss geography, politics, philosophy within the careful boundaries of what a free man and slave could safely debate. One evening Raphael asked, "What will you do after freedom?" Matteo had thought about little else. Create maps that are actually mine, maybe teach, maybe work independently. You could apply to the Royal Society. With your portfolio "I have no portfolio," Matteo interrupted quietly. "Everything I created before this office belongs to others. My London maps are credited as Cartographer unknown. I'd have to start over, proving myself with work I'm too sick to do." "Then we document everything now. I'll testify to your abilities. Don Vicente will provide references. And who employs a freed slave cartographer when they can hire a Spanish professional?" Raphael had no answer. They both knew the reality. Matteo's freedom, if he survived to receive it, would likely mean freedom to starve as an unemployed freedman rather than as a productive slave. The system was designed to make freedom almost as cruel as captivity. In June 1800, with 4 months remaining until his manumission date, Matteo began his last official cartography project, a comprehensive map of Lima's water supply system. The city's aqueducts, wells, and distribution networks were poorly documented. The Royal Cartography Office had been tasked with creating definitive maps to support urban planning. It was technical, unglamorous work, but important. Matteo threw himself into it with the obsessive focus he'd always applied to cartography, partly because it was his nature, partly because staying busy kept him from thinking about the cough that was getting worse, the weight he continued to lose, the exhaustion that never fully lifted. Raphael assisted him, handling the physical surveying work while Matteo focused on analysis and synthesis. They worked well together, the partnership Felipe and Matteo could never quite achieve because of guilt and exploitation. The map they created was, like everything Matteo touched, exceptional. It identified inefficiencies in the current water distribution, proposed improvements, flagged areas at risk during earthquakes. Municipal authorities praised it as exactly what the city needed. The cover documentation read, "Cartographic Survey by Matteo and Rafael Salinas, Royal Cartography Office, Lima, 1800. His name first. Properly credited, on work that would be preserved in municipal archives." When they finished in September, Don Vicente organized something unprecedented, a small ceremony within the office to acknowledge the work's completion. Minor officials attended. Wine was served. Matteo's contributions were publicly praised. It was the first time in his life anyone had celebrated his work while he was in the room. Raphael gave a short speech about Matteo's expertise and dedication. Don Vicente presented him with a bonus payment, real money, enough to mean something, and they gave him a gift, a high-quality compass in a carved wooden case with an inscription. To Matteo, navigator of spaces unseen. With respect from colleagues, Lima, September 1800. Matteo held the compass with shaking hands, his eyes wet. He tried to speak, couldn't find words, finally managed, "Thank you." It was the acknowledgement he'd ached for, and it came just as his body was giving out. October arrived, 3 months to freedom. Matteo's cough worsened into something undeniable. He began coughing blood. His fever spiked. The tremors in his hands intensified to where he could no longer draw fine details. The physician diagnosed advanced tuberculosis. In 1800 it was a death sentence, slow, painful, and inevitable. Matteo was confined to his quarters for bed rest. The office sent food, medicine that did little, visitors who didn't know what to say. Raphael came daily, reading aloud from books Matteo was too weak to hold. Don Vicente sent an urgent request to the viceroy. Grant early manumission on medical grounds, let the man die free. The request entered the bureaucratic machine and ground slowly through administrative processes. Weeks passed. Mateo deteriorated. By early November, he was barely conscious most days. The physician said it was a matter of weeks, maybe days. Raphael sat beside him one lucid evening, holding his friend's hand. "The manumission should come through soon," Raphael said, trying to sound confident. "Any day now." Mateo smiled weakly. "Bureaucracy moves at its own pace. You'll make it. Maybe. Or maybe I'll die 3 days before freedom. That would be appropriately tragic, wouldn't it?" "Don't. I'm not bitter," Mateo said, and it seemed true. "I'm just tired. I've been tired for a very long time." He coughed, the sound wet and terrible. When he recovered, he said, "If I don't make it, I need you to promise me something. Anything. My personal map. The one I made in secret years ago. It's still in Lima, hidden in the quarters where I stayed at the general's residence, under the floorboards, north corner. It has my signature. It's the first work I ever claimed as mine." Mateo described the map's location with precise geographical detail, even in his weakened state. "If you can find it, try to preserve it. Send it to Captain Graves if possible. Just let someone know I made it, that I signed it." "I'll find it," Raphael promised. "But you're going to survive to show me yourself." Mateo squeezed his hand weakly. "I navigated a lot of impossible spaces, but I'm not sure I can navigate this one." The Viceroy's approval for early manumission arrived on November 18th, 1800. Mateo died on November 17th. 24 hours separated him from the freedom he'd spent his entire life creating maps toward. He passed away in the early morning, with Raphael beside him. His last conscious moments were spent holding the compass from the office ceremony, the needle pointing north, steady and true. Raphael closed his eyes with a grief that surprised him in its intensity. He'd known Mateo for less than 4 years, yet the loss felt enormous. The office held a small funeral. Don Vicente spoke about Mateo's contributions to colonial cartography. A priest delivered brief remarks about eternal rest. Mateo was buried in Lima's common cemetery, in a section designated for freed slaves and lower-class workers. A geography of death as stratified as the geography of life. His tombstone, paid for by office funds Raphael organized, read simply, "Mateo Cartographer, 1775-1800, he mapped the world but traveled nowhere." It was the most official recognition he'd received while alive. Raphael didn't forget his promise. 3 weeks after the funeral, he went to the general's residence, now occupied by a different military officer, as Alvarez had been transferred to Madrid. He gained access by claiming to search for historical cartography department materials. He found the old quarters where Mateo had stayed years before, now used for storage. He found the north corner. He pried up floorboards, and he found the map. It was damaged, water stains, torn edges, faded ink from years hidden in darkness, but it was intact enough to recognize a comprehensive map of South America, extraordinarily detailed, with corrections to official charts, innovative notation systems, and in the corner, barely visible but definitely there, Mateo, Lima, 1793. Raphael carefully removed it, preserved it between protective boards, and did exactly what Mateo had asked. He sent it to Captain Thomas Graves in London, along with a letter explaining its origin and creator. Graves received the package in April 1801. He was deeply moved. He presented the map to the Royal Society with Mateo's full story, the enslaved cartographer whose work they'd published as unknown, who'd died just hours before receiving freedom. The Royal Society catalogued the map officially. South American survey by Mateo of Lima, deceased 1800, acquired posthumously. It was preserved in their archives. It was studied by geographers. It contributed to the body of geographical knowledge. Mateo's name, finally attached to his work, in an institution beyond Spanish colonial control. It was the victory he'd died believing was impossible. The maps Mateo created continue to exist in various archives. His London maps are in the British Library, His water system survey is in Lima's municipal collection. His posthumous South American chart is in the Royal Society's historical cartography section. Researchers who study them note their exceptional quality, their theoretical sophistication, their accuracy that sometimes exceeded what should have been possible given the era's technology. Historians debate how an enslaved person acquired such advanced mathematical and geographical knowledge. The mystery fascinates because the answer is simultaneously simple and horrifying. Extraordinary talent, exploited ruthlessly, developed precisely because he was denied the freedom to use it independently. Felipe lived until 1821, carrying guilt he never shed. In his personal papers, discovered after his death, he'd written, "I built my career on another man's genius while he died uncredited. God may forgive this. I cannot." General Alvarez finished his career with honors in Madrid, his reputation intact. Mateo's contribution to his success forever hidden in official records. Rafael continued as a surveyor and eventually became director of the Royal Cartography Office. He spent decades advocating for proper historical attribution of Mateo's work. Most of his efforts were ignored, but some things survived. Captain Graves published a paper in 1802 titled On the Intellectual Capacity of Enslaved Persons, a case study in colonial cartography. It was controversial, mostly dismissed, but it planted ideas in the emerging abolitionist movement. And Mateo's maps remained, beautiful, precise, bearing his name in archives that outlasted the empire that had enslaved him. There's a moment in the historical record that's easy to miss. A small notation in the Vice-Regal archives, dated November 20th, 1800, 3 days after Mateo's death. It's a receipt for the purchase of one compass, brass, standard military issue, to be delivered to the common cemetery for inclusion with the deceased cartographer Mateo. Rafael had bought it, had the grave opened, had placed Felipe's compass, the one Mateo had carried hidden for years, in the casket before it was sealed again. So Mateo was buried with a compass, after all, buried with the instrument he'd been denied in life, the tool that represented everything he'd been capable of and prevented from becoming, the symbol of navigation, autonomy, and the freedom to choose one's own direction. He'd spent his life reading maps better than generals, creating strategies that shaped colonial military operations, solving geographical problems that stumped trained professionals, navigating spaces physical and abstract with extraordinary precision. But he was never allowed to hold a compass until the very end, and by then, he no longer needed it to find his way. The question that lingers, the question historians still debate, is not whether Mateo's story happened. The documents exist, the maps survive, the testimonies are recorded. The question is, how many other Mateos existed whose maps were destroyed, whose names were erased, whose extraordinary abilities were consumed by a system designed to deny their humanity while exploiting their gifts? How many navigators who were never allowed to navigate their own lives? How many minds that mapped the world while trapped in rooms they couldn't leave? The compass in Mateo's grave wasn't a tool by that point. It was an apology and an accusation. Both remain unanswered.